welcome you for
Dr. Ajay, is it a problem with my connectivity or?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
yeah. Sorry for this break. I think there was a internet connection problem. So yeah, so I was giving the introduction about Dr. Ambedkar Chair. So Minister of Social Justice and Empowerment has started Dr. Ambedkar Foundation at Delhi. Dr. Ambedkar Foundation has started Dr. Ambedkar Chair across India, and this is the 25th chair here at Symbiosis International Deemed University in Pune. This chair focuses on Dr. Ambedkar's thought and contribution to education in India. This December we will finish 1 year. Till now, we have completed so many seminars, conferences, workshops, and such talks. What digital and face-to-face talks. So, with this brief introduction, I would ask Sir Dr. Ajay Chaudhary sir, he is a chair professor, to introduce ma'am for this panel. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Himangi, for giving me opportunity, and I welcome Dr. Renu for in this giving this lecture on a webinar. And before that, I wanted to introduce Dr. Renu Vinod. Though I wanted to tell you all participants that she is a senior to me, and we are from the same center, CSSS JNU. So just a brief introduction I would like to give about the Dr. Vinod, Renu Vinod. Dr. Renu Vinod is an adjunct lecturer, sociology at the Symbiosis School for Liberal Art, Symbiosis International University, and she prior to that she worked at the Savitribai Phule University Pune and in the development sector in Delhi in various organizations like UNDP, Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, and the Times Foundation. Her research and advocacy in the development sector covered areas such as informal sector livelihood, the right to information, and corporate social responsibility. Dr. Renu Vinod obtained her PhD from, as I said, JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. She is a recipient of the Ramus Mundus Scholar Grant to the University of Groningen, the Netherlands, and Uppsala University, Sweden in 2013. She received the Erasmus Mundus Expert Asia Consortium grant for the postdoctoral research at Uppsala University in 2016. And recently, she has, published a book called "Modernity in India: Issues, Perspective, and Challenges," which is published by the Routledge in 2023. So I welcome Dr. Renu Vinod to deliver her lecture on the topic. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ajay, for giving me this opportunity to speak to your audience. Thank you, Himangi. Himangi, if I could request you to please upload the presentation for me, and it will be really helpful to have someone change the slides. Thank you for that, Himangi. If we could go to the next slide. Right. So I look forward to sharing some of my thoughts with all of you on this topic on the middle class and the caste question. I will begin by laying out the order of contents that I will be following for the next 45 to 50 minutes. So I start with the conceptual ground, which I will cover on class and caste. I will specifically use Max Weber's and Eric Olin Wright's definitions of class, and I'll come into that in more detail in a bit. I will also employ the concept of opportunity hoarding as used by Eric Olin Wright in relation to another concept called social closure to examine the class-caste connection in India. Once I do that, I will move on to a brief history of the middle class in India, simply to examine how the dynamics between class and caste interactions played out during the colonial rule and how this has shaped the post-independence connection between these two phenomena. So that's the idea. Once I am done with that, I will go on to looking at some of the contemporary definitions of the middle class, especially. I am trying to look at whether there have been any changes in the way in which the middle class has been defined. I will highlight some of those new dimensions that are being emphasized in contemporary definitions of the middle class and what that tells us about the broader changes taking place in Indian society. Next, I will go to the concepts of opportunity hoarding and social closure in terms of how they apply across three segments. One is the corporate sector, the other is the entrepreneurial field, and the third is the public sector. And finally, I will end by highlighting the growth of a new class, which some call a class in making. That is, it is not yet a class for itself, it is still pretty fragmented, and that is called the precariat class, and the conditions under which it is growing in India and what that means for class and caste interactions in India. Himangi, if you could go to the next slide, please. Right. So to begin with then, I will use two definitions of class, one by the classical German sociologist Max Weber and the other by the Marxist American sociologist Eric Olin Wright. So according to Max Weber, you can't define class in black and white terms the way, say, Karl Marx did it, in terms of looking at classes as either owning the means of production or not owning means of production, such as land or labor or capital. In fact, he preferred to use a term called class situation. And class situation, according to Weber, is determined by the common economic interests of a group and the common life chances or opportunities a group has in the market based on the possession of certain commodities or skills. So, for example, if a group is a land-owning group, they possess land as a commodity, they would have a common economic interest in ensuring that land prices stay high. On the other hand, if one talks about chartered accountants who provide certain kinds of services, who own certain skills and provide those services in the market, they would have a common economic interest in there being a great demand for chartered accountants in the market. So this, for Weber, is class situation. And since we are talking about caste in India, I would also like to bring to your notice what Weber said about caste. So for Weber, caste is a status group, okay? And a status group for Weber is a status basically is a position which is determined on the basis of how society estimates your honor. Does society give you a high social estimate or a low social estimate? So very simplistically understood, if you are a so-called high caste, there is a high social estimation of honor for your status group. And if you are a so-called low caste, then there is a low social estimation of honor by society. So that is a status group for Weber. So for Weber, caste is like a status group. And caste is a vertical structure in which the relationships between people are based on what he calls superordination and subordination. And there are privileged groups within this vertical caste structure. And in this vertical structure, the high castes enjoy greater social honor in society, like I just mentioned. Now, for Weber, there are some similarities between class and caste. Both class as well as caste are types of stratification, social stratification. Therefore, they are hierarchical in nature. Moreover, this next point was important for Weber. Types of stratification, whether they are social like caste or economic like class, or even political like party membership, they are all means of determining and maintaining power in society. So it is in the context of understanding how power is wielded in society that Weber was interested in social stratification, right? So while political, economic, and social power are different, they are not independent always of each other. Okay, they can act upon each other. So social honor, such as a high caste status in the Indian context, can be a basis for both political as well as economic power, and has also been frequently used for this. And I'm sure in our public field or in the media, we can come across multiple examples of that. But I would like to give you an example. Himangi, if we could just go to the next slide. This quotation is an excerpt of a response in 2022 by the journalist Dalit in the digital news platform called The Print, to an article which came in the British weekly newspaper called The Economist in the same year, which had this title. The title was "Why Brahmins Lead Western Firms but Rarely Indian Ones." So Dilip Mondal listed many points, but I'm just quoting this part, which I think is relevant for us. Quoting Dilip Mondal, "The argument that the Baniyas rule the Indian corporate world largely holds ground because most corporations in India are traditionally family owned. And in many of them, the biggest stakeholder or the promoter group provides the CEOs. Kinship, familial relations, and caste affiliation might have played a role in selecting the top managers. As most of the big businesses in India are owned by the Baniyas, it's not surprising that in the Forbes list of India's wealthiest in 2021, in the top 20, 12 are from the same community," close quotes. So if we were to look at this particular excerpt from Weber's point of view, if you look at kinship, familial relations, and caste affiliation, they are part of what comprises one's social status, one's social attributes. And if one belongs to a high caste community, then one has very strong caste associations, caste networks, and linkages, which can give one a leg up. So these social attributes play positively in as the writer himself says, in sometimes giving one a position like a manager, which is a class position, right? So here we see how class and caste or social and economic attributes play positively upon each other, right? So this is where similarities end in, so he talks about social stratification, both are forms of social stratification, both are forms of determining and maintaining power, and so on. But there is, and here I can tell you, a fundamental difference between class and caste, which many of you already know. First of all, class is part of a modern society, right? A market capitalist society, where we are made to believe, yes, we are made to believe that the market is blind to social identity markers like class, caste, race, gender, and so on, and the market apparently provides individual, irrespective of all of these social identities, a level playing field, is what we are told to believe, right? And therefore, despite our gender, caste, race, we can go up the class hierarchy if we are able to accumulate profit or rent or whatever, or if we are able to have the kind of skills or provide the kind of services that are in demand in the market. Okay, before we proceed to the next point, let me quote the very famous Indian sociologist Andre Betai's 1965 definition of caste. He defines caste in this way: caste is characterized by endogamy, hereditary membership, and a specific style of life, which sometimes includes the pursuit of traditional occupations, such as that of priests, for example, and is usually associated with a more or less distinct ritual status in a hierarchical system. So it is the ritual status that gives one a high or a low social honor. The higher the ritual status, the higher you are up on the caste hierarchy, and the lower the ritual status, the lower you are. Now, if you look at this particular definition of caste by Andre Betai, endogamy refers to marriage ties within one's caste, and hereditary membership means membership by birth. These two characteristics make caste mobility very difficult, if not impossible. So what is left? Style of life. So this is where we come to the point where lower caste groups imitate the style of life of upper caste groups. And this is where the first generation Indian sociologist M.N. Srinivas used the now very famous term called Sanskritization, right? So M.N. Srinivas called Sanskritization the imitation of the ritual beliefs and lifestyles of the upper caste. Examples of this would be giving up non-vegetarian food or giving up alcohol are all examples of such attempts. Now, another sociologist, Indian sociologist, Surinder Jodhkar says, this is not an easy process. This whole process of Sanskritization, neither is it easy, nor is it quick. It is a slow process, which also requires the approval of the local upper caste, which is most likely the local reference group for the imitating caste. And it also perhaps requires a simultaneous increase in the economic and political clout of this imitating caste. All of this takes time. Sometimes it can even lead to violence against the imitating caste by those who sense a threat by another group which is trying to take up already limited resources. So this is Sanskritization. There is another strategy for social mobility, which is through affirmative action, which the Indian government has enforced, especially in public employment and education. This should ideally, affirmative action should ideally allow a family to move up the class hierarchy intergenerationally at least. It does not entail a change in caste position. Here also there are extreme challenges facing the scheduled castes. So Divya Baird and Anthony Heath conducted a study in 2010 using National Employment Service data of 2004, and they found, this is within quotes, SCs and STs, despite reservations, seem to consistently lag behind the higher castes with regard to access to professional occupations, with little or no improvement in their relative position over time. And as far as I close quotes here, as far as the upper castes are concerned, their traditional proximity to greater wealth, or at least slightly more wealth, gives them an upper hand when they look for occupational opportunities in the market. So wealth also helps the upper castes. So in this way, class and caste work upon each other in ways that can either hinder upward mobility or allow certain groups to monopolize pre-existing caste privileges. Okay, that is Max Weber. Now, if we look at the American sociologist Eric Olin Wright's definition of class, if we could go to the next slide, Hemangi. Yeah, so the previous slide. That's Eric Olin Wright's definition of class. So he looks at two approaches to study class. One is the social stratification approach, and the other is the the opportunity hoarding approach. Now, in the social stratification approach, he says that one must look at intersections between individual attributes and material conditions. So according to him, individual attributes can be talent, it can be intelligence, it can be great drive, and so on. Material conditions can be income, wealth, geographic location. So the important thing is for us to look at how individual attributes and material conditions intersect to produce class differences. So according to him, people who belong to the high class have high talent, high drive, high income and wealth that allow them to live exclusively different lives from others. Middle classes are then those who have enough money, enough talent, enough education to participate fully in the mainstream way of life, however a society defines its mainstream way of life. And then you have the lower classes, which lack the required individual and material, the individual attributes and material conditions to participate fully or live securely above the poverty line. So Eric Olin Wright also channeled Max Weber when he said that those who have high class status usually have access to jobs that pay a very high income and provide attendant privileges. This kind of a class would usually also have the means at their disposal to hoard opportunities for themselves. And they will use those means to hoard opportunities for themselves and create a sort of social closure by which those who are not class peers will be kept out, right? So if you look at an example in the Indian context, and I'm sure this is applicable internationally as well, if you look at the challenges that one faces in entering and even clearing the education system in India, we are all tested on what are considered to be objective criteria. But what are these objective criteria? One will require sound knowledge of English, right? And in some of these national level entrance examinations, you might require some knowledge of basic mathematics, logic. These are perhaps soft and hard skills that are easily accessible to those who have what is called cultural capital. Yeah, but those who don't have this are going to be left behind, right? So these kinds of testing processes are very difficult for students from marginalized communities, many of whom could be first generation learners. So objective criteria that demand certain soft and hard skills function as tools for opportunity hoarding and social closure for those groups which are already privileged. And in India, as we have seen, there is a class caste connection in determining privilege. So membership in the upper caste and possession of cultural capital like knowledge of English, generations of educated family members and so on are examples of cultural capital. So upper caste membership and possession of cultural capital are strongly linked. Therefore, cultural capital is used as a tool to hoard opportunity for caste peers. This is despite there being very clear legislative measures which has forbidden the blatant discrimination of people. So officially there are no policies to discriminate, but subtly the cultural capital and upper caste connection sort of weaves its way into the official workplace and education and so on. So there are no rules or measures to prevent discrimination operating through the demand for cultural capital, such as knowledge of English or the expectation to behave like a cultured or cosmopolitan person, which is an advantage in a cosmopolitan educational or occupational setting. So in both Max Weber's and Eric Olin Wright's definitions of class, the intersection of the social and the economic are fundamental to ensuring access to either more power in the case of Weber or to the highest paying jobs that lead to more benefits and privileges in the case of Eric Olin Wright. So social attributes like upper caste state, which brings the upper castes access to social connections and other valued resources, in addition to high income or middle income, they are integral to gaining advantages in the hunt for a suitable occupation in the market, right? So this is the conceptual ground which has been covered. Himangi, if we could go to the next section, please, the next slide. Here we look at a brief history of the middle class in India. Now, what are we looking at here? We are looking at how pre-existing caste privileges, such as access to education, some, if not a lot of wealth, and the performing of traditional occupations, whether they are intellectual occupations or commercial occupations, gave some groups, usually caste groups, greater proximity to the British. And this paved the way for certain kinds of class and caste intersections, which benefited these groups. immensely in the context of the economic reforms that the British brought to India. So when the British introduced various reforms in India, in the fields of science and technology, medicine, law, business, communication, and telegraph, and so on, the first group to take advantage of these changes were the upper castes. Because, like I said, they had certain economic, social, and educational privileges which had brought them in close proximity to the British. So, based on the kind of economic functions that the middle class performed, B.B. Mishra, a historian, divided the middle class in the colonial era into 4 categories. In 1961 is when he brought out this categorization. So the first category of the middle class included the commercial middle class. You have the bankers, the brokers, the middlemen, contractors in plantations. This is one group. The second group of the middle class, you have the money lenders, the landed middle class. The third group of middle class were the industrial middle class. You had the shipbuilders, for example. And the fourth group of the middle class consisted of the educated middle class. You have modern professionals like lawyers, doctors, engineers. So you see an overlap between who might be entrepreneurs, landed certain kind, some landed property persons, as well as professionals, educated professionals in B.B. Mishra's distinction. Now, all of these 4 categories, if you look at them, have both individual attributes as well as material conditions which worked in their favor. If you are born in a landed family, over a period of time, you are going to acquire a talent or a skill to understand how land prices work or what is fertile land and so on. And of course, your material condition as an inheritor of landed wealth already gives you certain advantages. So having these individual and material conditions makes it very strategic for you to hoard the opportunity which comes in your way when the British brings in land reforms, for example. So the opportunity hoarding which comes for those who belong to certain upper caste groups who also happen to have access to some wealth um, was pretty clear in the context of colonial India, leading to increased economic and caste status, which they obviously wanted to preserve, right? So over a period of time, they were able to educate themselves more, enter into the civil services, and so on, and reinforce and strengthen their material wealth as well. So this middle class was a powerful and exclusive group. They comprised intellectuals, they comprised bureaucrats, they comprised professionals. So the Marxist philosopher Ejaz Ahmed in 1982 identified the middle class, the Indian middle class, as the in-between class between the aristocratic and propertied or bourgeois class and the working class. And this middle class's bureaucratic and technical skill also gave it close proximity to the state and the resources of the state. I also find the sociologist Satish Deshpande's definition in 2003 of the Indian middle class very useful. Here again, you find the intersection between the economic and the social. The social attributes of the middle class, according to Deshpande's definition, would be that it is strongly upper caste, predominantly Hindu, educated and English speaking. And its economic attributes would be that it possesses technical and social skills and are engaged in white collar work. Right? This is not true anymore, I'm sure, but according to Deshpande's definition, traditionally, the Indian has associated itself with the Congress party. More recently, sociologists Surinder Jodhkar and Asim Prakash in 2011, they differentiated between the old and the new middle class. The old middle class is pretty much what B.B. Mishra's distinction, Ejaz Ahmed, Satish Deshpande's description of the middle class would have us know. They were they were just spillovers from the colonial era, and this is the first moment in the growth of the middle class in India, right? And after independence, with the move towards industrialization and development, there came about the second moment in the growth of the middle class. So this second moment occurred in post-independent India when the middle class drew its members from the old middle class, but the middle class began to get increasingly associated with the salaried bureaucratic class working with the government in the civil services. And so the association of the middle class with what B.B. Misra's definition talked about, the commercial, landed, trading, industrial class began to go into the background, and the middle class as a salaried civil service class began to emerge during this period. So during the period after independence, the state also introduced constitutionally guaranteed affirmative action policies, and therefore we began to see some changes in the social composition of the middle class. It began to include members of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. And from the 1990s onwards, with the implementation of Mandal Commission reform suggestions, the OBCs as well, especially in public and government sector institutions, and through those policies into the middle class. So this was the second moment. Then in the third moment in the development of the middle class, we see this happening in the 1980s onwards. And this third moment is also symptomatic of much larger changes taking place in Indian society. So while during the period immediately after independence, being middle class did not just mean certain economic functions, but also certain values. There were certain middle class values which were considered to be predominantly modern values. So the belief in rationality, scientific spirit, the belief in the rule of law, belief in secularism, at least in the public realm, financial prudence, belief in savings and all of those, these were associated with this old middle class in the first and second moments. But from the 1980s onwards, the middle class began to be identified as a consumer class. And this tells us about the changes taking place in Indian society and economy more broadly, right? So market pressures globally and in the domestic spheres began to affect Indian society. And as a consequence, the middle class began to get more inspired to become more acquisitive in nature. That is to focus on building personal wealth. It was no longer shameful to focus on personal wealth building and personal material possession hoarding. However, there were also other members of the middle class in this very group whose sense of collective moral responsibility had not yet been completely abandoned. So you had middle class activists who led social movements around the environment, around gender, around issues of historically marginalized groups like tribals and forest dwellers who were at the receiving end of development projects, right? So just like the colonial era, the middle class, even in the 1980s, wanted to be some sort of guides on how India should, how Indians should think, what we should think about development, what we should think about fundamental rights, and so on and so forth. And according to Jyotka and Prakash, both the upper castes as well as the wealthier sections of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes were members of this new middle class. Right. So this is a very brief and outline of the middle class in the colonial times and after independence, going up to liberalization and so on. Himangi, if we could just move to the next slide, please. So we come to now the contemporary definitions of the middle class. We stopped the previous section with the broader changes taking place in the Indian society and the economy, and the identification of the middle class as a consumer class, right? Post 1991 was the time that India witnessed the rolling back of the state from education and employment. And so you had terms such as drivers of economic growth, tax-paying class being associated with the middle class, because now individuals were expected to take more responsibility for their own success than relying on the state now. As per most reports, India's middle class was an ever upward growing trajectory. So a report published in 2023 by the People Research on India's Consumer Economy or PRICE and India's Citizen Environment has found that the middle class is set to grow from 31% in 2020-2021 to 61% in 2047. So according to Price, now look at the range within the middle class. A middle class Indian is one who earns between 1.09 lakhs and 6.46 lakhs annually. And a middle class household is one which earns between 5 lakh and 30 lakh rupees annually. So what we are seeing here on the one hand is a focus on the economic dimension of the middle class. And on the other hand, what you're seeing is an internal difference in this economic dimension. You have lower middle class, middle class, upper middle class on the one hand. Now remember, we saw also that the middle class had become socially heterogeneous as well during this time, which meant that there were internal caste differences within the middle class, and there were those with inherited caste privileges whose natural tendency, I suppose, towards opportunity hoarding and social closure meant that differences between castes had to be maintained as well, right? For example, there is a study by the anthropologist Sarah Dickey in 2012 in Madurai town of Tamil Nadu. From the late 1990s onwards, she was studying the middle class there. She showed how class tended to take on unspoken, unwritten, but tacitly understood caste rules in the everyday manner of functioning of people. So in Dickey's study, for instance, those who were English and Tamil speakers perceived themselves to be middle or upper middle class, whereas those who were only Tamil speakers perceived themselves to be poor. Okay, now this is as far as cultural capital is concerned. Now look at consumption itself. Since consumption is the most important middle class activity, look how caste rules, which are unwritten, unspoken, seem to enter into consumption. Also, English, one more point I wanted to make was that if you remember in the colonial era, it was the upper castes were English educated, English speaking, and also having proximity to the British. So perhaps there is a colonial hangover of this connection between English language, upper caste, and higher status. Now coming back to consumption and caste differences coming within the how people consume. For instance, Tamil Brahmins, who occupy the highest position in the caste hierarchy in Madurai, but not necessarily in the class hierarchy, have simple tastes in fashion and don't publicly display wealth. So perhaps one can know who is a Tamil Brahmin through their embodied capital. That is how they behave, how they dress up, and so on. On the other hand, subcastes of the Chettiars, who are another high caste group and also amongst the wealthiest communities because of their membership in a commercial caste group, display their abundant jewelry and expensive fashion at private weddings. But in their own homes, they don't spend and display very expensive consumer goods. So following unwritten caste rules is a tool of opportunity hoarding, leading to the social closure of those for whom such caste rules will not apply. Just as caste rules are used to reinforce internal differences of apparent superiority and inferiority within the middle class group through certain kinds of consumption behavior, caste connections can also open up avenues to hoard opportunities in the occupational sector, in the economy. For example, those who have inherited privilege, such as, it is perceived that Tamil Brahmins are predominant in the IT industry in Tamil Nadu. Though S. Shakti's study, as we will see later on, say that the IT industry has the non-upper caste as well, and some of these perceptions tend to downplay their experiences in the IT industry. But generally, there is a perception that Tamil Brahmins are in the IT industry. Caste and kinship roles play a very important role in entering into the corporate sector and into leadership positions there. Caste also rears its head in Madurai in terms of determining who owns businesses. So in Tamil Nadu, some of the subcastes of the Chettiars and the Nadars are the leaders of business. And what else do we find? The Dalits are usually employed as sanitation workers by the government. So traditional caste roles and occupational roles seem to very smoothly transport themselves and into modern occupations as well, right? A recent newspaper headline grabbed my attention. The Indian Railway Board, in more than 70 years of its post-independence existence, has its first Dalit chairman of the Railway Board. And I noticed that next to chairman, you had to prefix the Dalit. So it is as if the identity cannot leave one. And even if one is going up the class hierarchy and there is class mobility, the caste identity seems to stay firmly entrenched. Himangi, if I could just go to the next slide, please. Now that we've looked at some of the newer ways of defining the middle class, I want to look at specific ways in which opportunity hoarding and social closure are operating across these three segments of the corporate sector, entrepreneurial realm, and the public sector. So looking at the corporate sector, we see different ways in which opportunity hoarding and social closure are in operation. To me, the most predominant way, if one looks at the kind of scholarly works that have been written on this, is anything to go by, there is a narrative which is created. And if we can even look at media and we will see this narrative. There is a narrative that dichotomizes into two apparently mutually exclusive categories: merit on the one hand and quota on the other. Right? These are the two apparently mutually exclusive categories. Merit and talent are reduced to individual attributes. And these individual attributes of merit and talent seem to be a natural or biological attribute of upper castes. And how are talent and merit explained? They're explained through English speaking skills, sound English speaking skills, and also embodied cultural capital, right? What is embodied cultural capital here? Family background, which gives them certain kinds of culture, certain manners, a way of conducting themselves, which are seen as essential advantages in culturally diverse and cosmopolitan work environments. So on the other hand, those who have a heavily accented English or a family background which does not boast of multiple generations of graduates, for example, and also those who have very weak social connections, caste networks, which are usually the scheduled caste candidates, puts them on a weaker pedestal through this narrative which is created. So on the one hand, you have this narrative which dichotomizes merit and quota, right? And on the other hand, there is this narrative continuing by saying that somebody who has gotten in using quota cannot be as qualified as somebody who got in without it. And therefore, there is this perception that the qualified without quota candidate is the binary opposite of that, of the candidate who gotten an educational seat through quota. And this narrative is nicely completed when companies start talking about dilution of merit. And this is there also in the scholarly works given by Jyotka, Thorat, and others. So what we will find is that there is talk about dilution of merit. There is fear that if candidates from reserved categories are brought in, there is the possibility of merit being diluted, and we have to focus on profit making. And profit cannot be compromised, because if you compromise on profit, your salaries can get affected as well, right? And so since we are talking about two apparently mutually exclusive categories here of merit and quota, and companies cannot compromise on profit and they have to choose between the two, the choice is pretty clear what they should choose, right? Either merit candidates or quota. So the consequences of such acts are manifest in the lacunae in leadership posts of scheduled castes in the corporate sector. That is, there is hardly any leader from scheduled caste communities in the corporate sector. So a study by S. Shakti of the IT industry in Chennai found, in that study, she found that all but one of the executives she interviewed were upper castes. The upper caste, lower caste distinction was also present in the professional division within companies. So she found that high-paying executive managerial posts were generally monopolized by the upper castes, and support staff posts were monopolized by the lower castes, right? And according to the S. Shakti, this distinction can be true on account of what she calls pre-existing caste privileges and what she calls upper caste network building, which takes place during workshops and conferences. And what happens here in the form of opportunity hoarding is predominantly upper caste executives of these companies, they act as gatekeepers, especially during the time that they conduct interviews, where they will suddenly bring in family background. According to studies by Jyotka, Shakti, Thorat, and others, they say that they will bring in the family background into the question to see how good a fit the candidate is to the culture of the company. Not just in this sort of vertical relation, even in horizontal relations, in the form of casual conversations in the company, she has found that caste is firmly entrenched. So when colleagues go out for meals, apparently, if they go to a non-vegetarian restaurant, the Brahmin colleagues will come, but they will not even touch a beverage in that non-vegetarian restaurant. So in these ways, caste keeps appearing, even if it is not part of official company policy, right? But these unofficial practices eventually affect employee morale on the one hand and promotions on the other, right? Now let's also look at caste in the context of entrepreneurship. Asim Prakash conducted a study, the sociologist Asim Prakash in 2015 conducted a study of 90 Dalit entrepreneurs in 13 districts across 6 states, and he observed the following. Dalit entrepreneurs believed that their market situation was inherently disadvantageous by virtue of their caste status, as a result of which they reaped lesser benefits from capital investments in relation to upper caste entrepreneurs. The market, which is apparently a level playing field, we are made to believe, did not care much for the quality of the goods or services that Dalit entrepreneurs had to offer. The market conditions were monopolized by upper caste entrepreneurs, and market itself tended to take on a casteized nature, selectively permitting or disabling successful economic exchange based on the monopoly and strong caste networks of the upper caste entrepreneurs. So Asim Prakash used a social structure and social networks approach, which is closely tied to Eric Olin Wright's study of opportunity hoarding, leading to social closure and exclusion of less privileged groups. The same approach was seen to be in operation in the context of entrepreneurship. I finally come to the public sector and how opportunity hoarding and social closure work here. So data made public by the Ministry of Personnel, Public Grievances and Pensions in 2019 shows a very good piece of news, that the representation of SCs and STs in government and public sector organizations is higher relative to their population. But if you look closely at the numbers, they will show you that it is in the Group C category, which is of lesser skilled workers and of Safai Karamcharis, where you will find the bulk of SC and ST employees. So while in terms of numbers, the requirements for quota are very well met, we are seeing that even in the formal public sector, this traditional caste-based occupational categorization is spilling over into the public sector as well, right? And therefore, even in government organizations, very few members of the scheduled caste and other marginalized communities occupy leadership positions. This endurance of caste as a social structure is such that even when the state attempts to prevent opportunity hoarding and social closure, both obviously have to be in operation, because otherwise there is no other way of explaining data like this. There is a data which was recently brought out, and this is within quotes. 13% of scheduled castes, who comprise 16.6% of the population, and 5.5% of scheduled tribes, who comprise 8.6% of the population, occupy Group A jobs, which is much less relative to their population size. So I want to give you one more example. If Hemangi, if we could go to the next slide. I want to take the example of the judiciary. As you know, it is in the judiciary and the defense sectors that no reservation is possible. It does not apply at all. So in principle, it is unconstitutional to discriminate on the basis of caste and to socially exclude individuals based on identity markers like caste and gender and so on. But look at the judiciary. Okay, according to a review published by the Supreme Court Observer in 2024, 36.4% of sitting judges in 2023 were from the Brahmin community, and the population of Brahmins in India is 5%. Okay, according to the 2011 census. So the Supreme Court review also pointed out, this is within quotes, a large part of the rest of the bench is represented by judges from Bania, Bengali Kayastha or Rajput communities. There has been little focus on appointing judges from Bahujan communities over the years, closing quotes, right? In 2024, about 12.1% of Supreme Court judges are from scheduled caste and OBC community, that is 12.1%. But according to the National Sample Survey Organization report published in 2007, SCs and OBCs together comprise 61% of our population. So one can only explain this huge discrepancy in terms of the population numbers of SCs, OBCs and the representation in the judiciary through the strategies of opportunity hoarding and social closure that is obviously in operation in the judiciary as well. At this point, I also want to bring to your notice a trend that can affect those who rely on affirmative action policies. So affirmative action policies in public organizations has improved opportunities for those who belong to historically marginalized groups, as it must. It is expected that that is what should happen. But in India, since 1991, we are witnessing a new trend, which can have a negative impact on reservation in employment and education. The All India Survey on Higher Education in 2020-2021 has shown that the government is investing lesser and lesser in education and employment. And these spaces are being opened up for the private sector also to invest in. So according to an article in the Frontline in 2023, TK Rajalakshmi points out that as far as higher education is concerned, more than half of Indian colleges, that is 65%, are private and unaided, and there are 21.4% government colleges, right? And the same trend can be said about enrollment as well. So the rollback of the state has very important ramifications, negative ones usually, for those who rely on government intervention in the public sector. So in the context of higher education, what we see is that the share of SCs, STs, and OBCs remains relatively stable up to the secondary school level. This is Rajalakshmi's article, and shows a slight dip in the senior school level, only to decline sharply in the higher education sector. So according to Rajalakshmi, there is a huge and serious gap between aspiration and opportunity. And again, sticking to this particular article, one also finds the same trend happening in public sector employment. A public enterprise survey conducted for the period 2014 to 2022 showed that more than 5 lakh jobs were eliminated in central public sector services during this period. And this has resulted in the reduction of the number of SC, ST, and OBC employees in public sector organizations. And a similar trend can be seen between the period 2013-2014 and 2023-2024 in public sector banks. And this is why there has been a demand for reservation in the private sector. And the private sector has been allowed to adopt a voluntary code of conduct. If it wants to have diversity and inclusion policies, it can have. If it does not want to, nobody questions it. And from what one sees, diversity and inclusion seems to be restricted to gender, differential abilities, and so on. Caste is very rarely brought into the picture. Yeah, and the private sector throws the ball back into the government's court, saying the government has to focus on education. So the onus is usually on the state, which has consistently tried to roll back its requirements or its intervention in these two sectors. So it is in this context that one can ask the question: why is it that despite the increasing political representation of marginalized communities, especially in state level politics, when it comes to social and economic dimensions, as we have seen, the tools to hold privileges and opportunities and ensure the social closure of marginalized groups seem to have succeeded and endured? The preliminary answer at this point may lie in two parts. One, in tracing the endurance of caste to the historical privileges that upper castes have enjoyed, who by using tools of opportunity holding and social closure have only strengthened these privileges over time. And the second part can lie in looking at the Indian state, which, much like its colonial predecessor, seems nervous or ill-disposed towards meddling in matters in the cultural and religious realm, which is where Indians think caste belongs. So I would like to, with this, come to the final segment of my talk. Hemangi, if you could just go to the next slide, please. Yeah, in this background of growing privatization and the rolling back of the state, we need to pay some heed to the rise of informalization in India, which is definitely not a new phenomenon, but in post-1991, we see some changes. So the sociologist Reena Agarwala, in an article on informalization of the labor force, has pointed out that ever since the Indian government liberalized employment, it has focused less on the welfare of the working class. And she says that this is not just an Indian phenomenon, this is a global phenomenon. In 1991, the Indian government adopted the new industrial policy, which pushed for economic liberalization in the name of efficiency and competition and so on. According to the labor sociologist S.K. Bhaumik, between 1991 and 2001, the size of the informal sector has only increased, whereas the size of the formal sector has remained static. An article published by Barbara Harris White for the Hindu Center for Public Policy in 2024 showed that over half of the firms in the informal sector, that is 52%, are owned by OBCs and 13.2% by SCs. Finally, according to data registered with the eShram portal, which is the centralized database of unorganized workers, 70% of informal workers are from the SC, ST, and OBC community. The SC OBC community, as per the NSSO survey, is together 61%, but including the STs, 70% are in the unorganized sector. So this goes to show that where there is greater job insecurity, one finds groups with low to negative caste network, caste associations, and so on. So again, the social attributes and economic positions intersecting in a very negative manner. Now, with the shrinking of the formal sector, seen in the rolling back of the state, there has been a talk about a new class called the precariat class. This is a term which was made popular by the British economist Guy Standing in 2011. This class is characterized by temporary labor contracts, and there is little or no job security there. While there is criticism of the use of the term precariat in Indian society, because already we have an informal class, either this informal labor force where there is no job security, we need to pay some attention to this new concept of precarity class, because today in India, even educated and skilled persons are ending up as precariat labor. So according to a Niti Aayog policy brief which came out in 2022, now I'm putting this within quotes, in 2020-2021, 77 lakh workers were engaged in the gig economy. What is the gig economy? Here the definition is that it refers to a labor market which is characterized by short-term temporary work and freelance and temporary workers. So 77 lakh of us in 2020-2021 were gig workers. Secondly, the gig workforce is expected to expand to 2.35 crores by 2029-30 in less than a decade. The third point is, at present, about 47% of gig work is medium skilled jobs like clerical work, plant machine operators, and so on. 22% is high skilled, managers, professionals, and about 31% are low skilled, construction laborers, domestic help, and so on. So there seem to be sizable numbers of percentages of workers in the gig economy even today. Trends show the concentration of workers in medium skills is gradually declining, and that of the low skilled and high skilled is increasing. It may be expected that while the domination of medium skills would continue till 2030, gig work with other skills will emerge, close quotes. So I want to just bring one last example here of the intersection between the social, that is caste, and informal sector or precariat labor, that is class. Yeah. A recent study, a recent study performed by the V.V. Giri National Labour Institute found that 30% of all workers in the private sector and 32% in the public sector are employed via contractors. Labor contractors, that is those who contract workers for big industries like textile industries, construction industry, and all of that, are an example of precariat labor because their job conditions are all very insecure. And a study by Vivek Soundarajan and others in 2023 showed the differential experiences on caste lines of labor contractors who are part of this informal sector and work under conditions of precarity in the garment industry in Tamil Nadu. They found that lower caste labor contractors experience greater precarity than upper caste labor contractors because of their weaker caste networks, which made economic growth difficult, made most likely because of opportunity hoarding by the upper caste labor contractors, because of which they got lesser access to resources or opportunities for upward mobility. Also, they had weak leadership. Finally, and I want to end with this, the British social and economic historian R.H. Tawney, he wrote The Acquisitive Society more than 100 years ago, but it is still relevant today. An acquisitive society is one which is organized to reap profits and to build the personal wealth of its citizens. Indian society today is far more representative of acquisitiveness than it has ever been. Various lists have been released in the past few years, giving details about wealth generation by a few individuals or industry houses. According to the Hurun list of 2024, India has the third highest number of billionaires in the world, with the richest Asian being an Indian. We see, therefore, a growing emphasis on the acquisition of material wealth through an increased role for the private sector, taking place in the larger context of the rolling back of the state from education and employment and rising informalization and precarious labor. So we also see that the rise of the precariat class has to also be understood in the context of its internal social composition, which is very heterogeneous. So we will need to understand how the dynamics between caste and class are going to play out, and the tools for opportunity hoarding and social closure are employed in this scenario in the coming years. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Now the floor is open for question and answer. Yeah, one new message has come from. Yeah, can you read, ma'am?
Yeah,
It
it's
will be good.
yeah, can we also include the need of UPSC GS4 paper felt by various governments, the transformation of multi-ethical societies before pre-independence and pre-social revolutions towards single ethical system, and training on aptitude about conflict of interest skills and fiduciary skills? I'm not sure I understand this question. Could you please explain this question?
Hi everyone, my name is Prashant. So the intention of the question was to understand the education system, and like various governments has felt the paper on ethics, integrity and aptitude to be part of the syllabus of the UPSC papers. So there is a way that even government is trying to come up with a single vision on having that skills for the public servants to have fiduciary duties and to have like work in best interest to solve the ethical or moral dilemmas, and that skill has to be improved by all the people. It's not like based on one background or the other. It's general need for entire population.
Okay.
So yeah, maybe that should be included as a skill and as an education, essential education for everyone to learn on. So once we have a single version of ethics system or as a nation, then all these conflicts could be resolved easily. So I think that is the most way, like positive and constructive way to proceed with this problem. That's what I feel.
Okay. I mean, if I were to just respond to this, I'm not sure. I don't know much about this particular UPSC GS4 paper and the approach of the government there. As a sociologist, my skepticism would be on the definition of ethics and morality by people who are not at the receiving end of behavior which might be considered as lacking both. So if opportunity hoarding is not considered to be ethical or morally sound as a behavior, and it has continued till this date, and people in positions of power who can define how syllabi should be formulated and how ethics should be incorporated into such syllabi are members of these high caste groups which hoard these opportunities. I would suggest, and I think, one should closely read those definitions of ethics and morality, and whether they can have any practical positive effect. I'm not saying they won't have any at all. As we have seen, affirmative action policies, we can benefit if implemented in the right way. But again, my concerns would be around questions of caste, questions of historically privileged groups being in positions to define these and monopolize privileges. So that's how I would respond to this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. There's one hand raised, Vidyanand Kandgale, if I pronounced your name correctly. Vidyanand.
Okay, good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. I think after a long time, I heard a lot about this morality and ethics. And I think this is the most concern because I'm working with the university at Department of Education. And whatever the point you had raised in terms of positive affirmation, other form that the real question is the same thing happening. The way these policies or this form of has been treated, it's very interesting because many a times I see the students who had been enrolled to what teacher in terms of PhD scholar, in terms of masters, giving privileges because of being there as in faculty. I could just judge, and nowadays I can just predict also which student is going to be what and who is going to take him or her to the PhD concern or inform that policy. So when we talk about this morality, ethics, I found it's very superficial or difficult to talk. They talked about it, they discuss about it, but when it is perceived about that specific students or specific group of people, and if some of them is indifferent or in that part, that he or she has been treated very differently. But a majority of the students or majority form, they are still known or they had been studied or they had been perceived, they had been treated on the basis of caste, even though in the higher education, because that's the reason I'm teaching. And then I realized when the first semester, it's all went very well. There is a discussion, the faculties, teachers discuss and all that. The second semester, the gradually started demarcation, with the group, with the caste, with the structure. And then when it comes on the part of morality, ethics, inclusive society, positive affirmation, and nowadays the entire discussion goes in the classroom rather than in terms of scholarship also. This is for Sarthi, these are Sarthi guys, these are Bharti guys, there's the scholarships which had been funded to that specific group and a specific caste, so they are known by their that scholarship nowadays. So in that context, I thought your session is very excellent. And I know because we are teaching to student teachers, they are going in the schools, and then it will have a multiple effect. But even though they had this perception, I don't know how they are going to treat in the schools the students from different group, different castes, because they are being trained, educated, or that is all hidden curriculum. Basically, nobody talks about. But that's what I had observed, and I can guess it after 6 semester that some student and so and student will be in this group, in that class or that form. So I would like to have comment on comment or rather than your observation in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vidyanand. Thank you for sharing your experience.
Renu, I would like to pose some questions, being that there are some conceptualizations related to some of your thought. Basically, your presentation was very good by
Thank
bringing
you.
all those of class and middle class definition to how it is a relation with the caste, and you're trying to touch the Dalit question as well. When you're talking about the kinship, related to kinship, somewhere the AM Shah is also pinpointing like how the kinship, when we talk about a demography, because of the increasing the particular demography, it is actually keeping some group into danger. But AM Shah is actually pinpointing, saying that this particular kinship has been utilized to maintain their cultural hegemony, more precisely in the corporate sector. So and nobody is actually talking about how within the upper caste how they are maintaining, utilizing the kinships for for controlling the power, economic power in that particular. So I want your reflection on that. Second is that when you talk about the Sanskritization, it's a very old concept which has been utilized by Amin Srinivas. But somewhere Amin Srinivas also talk about that Sanskritization should not be looked out in the form of imitation. And the caste as a 21st century avatar is the last book when he talk about, where he is mentioning that caste is nothing but the protest It is should be seen in the form of protest. But I feel that Sanskaritization as a concept is not utilized, first not utilized by this, I mentioned to us, but it has been utilized by Dr. Ambedkar as well, explaining the caste system in India, how the caste actually perpetuating, spreading among the non-Brahmins. This is very unique way by using the TARDIS law of imitation, and he's bringing that particular approaches. So, shall we look out if by the end of the note of Amish was saying the caste as a protest, where Ambedkar is looking not as a protest, but it is as an imitation. So, how you actually perceive that one also, I would like to ask. And the third question is, I'm just taking little bit time off. And the third question is related to, Jyotka, Professor Jyotka has conducted one study related to private sector. And when we are talking about there should be inclusion in the private sector, how this particular labor has been particularly utilized. And in that regard, what Jyotka is mentioning, dealing that when the applications are not accepted by looking their caste, when he did some sort of the survey, and the same survey, same application has been resubmitted with the upper caste name, quote unquote, then it has been accepted. So there is a caste actually rolling out within the private sector, and of course you said that how it is declined their productivity and all those things. So Jyotka is also talking in that sense that how the caste is actually trying to caste is actually how stopping the lower caste to come inside or to grow for the inclusive. So, but that is also very important that it is not going up in that manner, because there is a restriction in the private sector. Any sectors, they include even in the private educational institution also, a little bit the caste is work out in a very different manner. So I need your reflection on that. And coming to the merit, when you talk about the merit versus caste, so I think Subramaniam, no, Ajanta Subramaniam has wrote a book on related to task, and she is making a point. So she is giving the impression that in the modern society, how the caste, how the merit is actually transferring into the caste only. So merit is nothing but the caste. So the merit has become another name of the caste in the present context. So for going that way, so I need your actually reflection on that. And I also request to all participant that language is not the matter. It doesn't mean that कि हमको English में ही बात करना है. You can speak in Marathi. Somebody will also translate, or Hindi as well. So there is no issue at all. So Renu, kindly give a reflection on this 2-3 very small questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Ajay. Not very small questions, and I hope I can satisfy you. But I think the first question you spoke about was on how caste privileges are maintained in the economic sector in terms of how the corporate sector caste kinship ties tend to be reinforced. I had an argument many years ago with somebody who told me that North Indians are better at business than South Indians. North Indians have a business DNA compared to South Indians. I'm just going to use that as an analogy or as an example to hopefully try and understand what you're saying or answer what you're saying. So when you use kinship ties, I think there is a tendency to think that people who belong to your own kinship group, especially if you are somebody belonging to a commercial kinship group or a commercial caste group, that you are so there is, say, business in your DNA which others outside of your group don't necessarily have. And I'm not saying that this is scientifically proven or that this makes any sense, but in casual conversations, in matters of business interests and so on, these very non-scientific and unfunded without and not having any evidence, these kinds of conversations seem to be taking center stage. And as far as kinship is concerned, one should also remember that caste networks for caste networks, monopolizing economic and social privileges is the most important priority. So if that means talking about DNA, if that means helping kin groups, if these are the ways in which monopolizing caste and economic privileges, if these are the strategies and tools such as helping kinship networks and so on, in which they are spoken about, then I would call it one of those similar strategies as opportunity hoarding that Eric Olin spoke about. Am I making sense? Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, it is there. Also, it has been actually charges like related to demography, how population is increasing. But I mean that the upper caste they are also actually extending their populations, but to save their empire and to utilizing that kinship is also a pinpoint. But that is not has been reflecting. Nobody's. I think AM Shah has made it that point by making families in India, where in one of the chapter he is actually focusing that by on the name of the trust, the trust to whom we should trust in that sense.
That's an unwritten caste rule. Trust. Who can you trust? You will only trust people within your own community.
Yes, yes.
And this is if you don't trust and if you go outside of it, you will be most likely you will lose your social reputation. You might
Yes.
be isolated. And this is something I think it is James Coleman in the context of social capital has talked about amongst Jewish diamond traders in New York. They are supposed to be competitors, but they help each other. And if you are a Jewish trader and I'm a Jewish trader and somebody comes to you, but I have something which is of use to them, you will direct them to me. So that competition won't work between us. You will not compete with me, because those unwritten rules will ensure that we stay united and keep out others from entering the business. So I would, so trust is considered to be one of those unwritten, codes of conduct, which increase trust and make these caste groups very endogamous. And I think that endogamy also translates into the companies that they set up. And the endogamy also translates into what we see in the Forbes India list. 12 out of 20 top entrepreneurs are apparently from the Baniya community. So it might seem to a lot of people, oh, it is in their DNA. But an Asim Prakash or an AM Shah would say, well, here if one looks closely, one will look at unwritten codes of conduct of caste in operation, allowing them to reinforce their monopolies and strengthen their monopolies.
Yeah.
Sure.
You had something else as well, right? You had some other question. I found the question on caste as merit very interesting. How general category somehow seems to have become naturally associated with merit. And I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of authors on caste who have written on this, but I'm keen to bring in Judith Butler here in the context of gender. She says that we are not born male or female, we become male or female. She took it from Simone de Beauvoir, who said we're not born women, we become women. Now, how do we become that? We become that by practice, through habit. We are told that. So this narrative around merit and quota, where merit becomes upper caste and quota becomes non-upper caste, has become so internalized and entrenched in us that the upper caste becomes naturally associated with certain attributes, specifically talent and merit, and the lower caste with the exact opposite of that. Just as women are naturally associated with feminine traits and men naturally with masculine ones. So that same, I would like to use that analogy to explain how caste has become a very naturalized phenomenon, and through this process of this practice of caste. The habits which have been formed over generations, which have made it seem natural now.
Yeah, shall I say something?
Yes, sure.
Dr. Chaudhary. Yeah, ma'am. I was just listening to the discussion, what Professor Chaudhary had also asked about. And then I found it very interesting what you said in the last is about trust. And then I just realized the same narratives has been formed in terms of politics or any form of in a place or state. Even you can see the movie, you can see in any form. The people who are from marginalized or so marginal, they are just followers. They had been never taught, trained, educated in that terms where they can come together, because that training, when I was a student of Mumbai University, I used to find that a specific group of communities that they have their linkages and they have belief each other on that, in terms that even in the case of Dalits and in case of other forms, I found that they do have, but the thought is there. when it comes to terms of business, and when it comes of the bigger challenges with it come, they don't believe in each other. I'm not commenting on any specific, but then this is my general observation. I can't say that's a research, but then it's very difficult to believe each other in terms of a lower socioeconomic group, because no, they are might be they have been entirely dependent on the higher authority or high caste. So whatever they says, that's the final word, or they will believe that, or even though that is not beneficial for them, but then they will follow or believe the higher form of authority. I think that, no, when you say trust, and then it's just stuck to mind. Thank you.
Perhaps social capital theory helps to understand how trust operates, because if a group is much stronger, if it has a very, strong groups tend to have, trust as one of those unwritten factors, as we saw in the context of the Jewish traders and so on. So somewhere perhaps there is this intersection between, a high caste and this, and certain kinds of, codes of conduct such as trust and other forms of endogamy, which serve to, and again, if I may, I keep going back to theory to help me here. Weber talks about Protestant ethics, in which he says that those who join Protestant sects have to prove themselves as people of very good discipline, of certain kinds of morality and habits. And once they have been vetted as having certain kinds of habits and morality, then they're allowed entry into certain Protestant sects. Once they enter into the Protestant sect, they have to be looked after literally by that Protestant sect. So the Protestant sect not only works as a social group, it also works as a sort of economic backing, right? If I am a businessman who is of very high morals and I will not cheat my customers and so on, and I have been vetted and brought into the sect, I can always take credit from you. You will give me credit because you are also a member of my sect, and it serves your interest to ensure that I don't go into loan or debt. So somewhere, the caste identity seems to operate in a way that serves interests, and trust seems to be one of those strategic tools that allow co-caste members or caste peers to to maintain that caste endogamy, grow economically, grow socially, and so on. So trust is essential, and the trust is built on the basis of knowledge of caste behavior, perhaps over a long period of time. So Nadars would know how other Nadars behave. Chettiars would know how other Chettiars behave. Banyas, some Banya subcaste would know how others in that same Banya subcaste would behave, and those become those abstract ideas or values which build trust, which then becomes a strategic tool to maintain certain privileges. Now, if you belong to a non-upper caste, you already lack those privileges because of lack of wealth and lack of all of these advantages, and therefore trust building becomes all the more difficult, since any kind of opportunity comes not from within the caste group, but from outside of it. That is the first point, and also the fact that it becomes more difficult when you don't possess any cultural capital or any resources, like Vidyanand said, to even trust each other, to be able to to build each other up. I mean, in this context, I think it would be interesting to understand what is now being called Dalit capitalism, right? There is Chandrabhan Prasad and the Dalit, I think, industry of Dalit chambers of commerce and industry. There is the which was set up in 2005. By no means does it mean that things have changed or we are a post-caste society or anything, but it would be very interesting to see how trust operates within established Dalit networks, how they manage to create and build trust, despite centuries of negative cultural capital and so on.
Actually, there is a difference, like in the form of the trust, like if Dalits are proceeding the trust to break the caste, and if upper caste is proceeding the trust to maintain the caste, that there is a little bit difference in that. So, and I also request to other participant to have a questions. Any questions there? मराठी हिंदी किसी में भी चलेगा. There is a question for you. Renu, there is a question for you.
Thank you. How the caste be made invisible in private corporate sector. You know, what's interesting is if you look at the kind of work which has come out about the private and corporate sector, officially caste is invisible. You're not supposed to be hired on the basis of caste or fired on the basis of caste. But unofficially, caste is ever present. So I will take the point made by Surinder Jyotka that you have to acknowledge that caste is there. Right now, the way in which the corporate sector is operating, the way in which there is this monopolizing of all the benefits and privileges, you can't ignore it. You can't say that it doesn't exist, because if you say that it doesn't exist, then why should you even talk about caste? Why should you even say that there is no historically marginalized community representative in leadership positions? That means you're talking about identity. Identity politics is important for you. So it goes in a different direction altogether. So if one looks at the fact that caste is being used as a tool to gatekeep and to leave out, to push certain people out, as Dr. Chowdhury said, upper castes are trying to maintain caste and lower castes are trying to break this whole caste monopoly and so on, and try to talk about something else. But how does one reach there if the group that is monopolizing says we don't do it? So I think it is important to say, to be able to have that conversation, that caste is there. It is being used in very subtle ways that make it difficult to question it. But that questioning should take place. And people who talk about, who use caste and in ways that they claim don't affect those who don't belong to similar caste positions, should also be held accountable. For that, we can't say that, I think we can't at this point say caste is invisible, or we should make caste invisible. That is where we should reach. I would say, not make caste invisible, not make caste relevant. I mean, that is where we should reach. But at this point, where caste is the most relevant thing for some people, who refuse to move away from their caste identities because it serves them, I think we should then talk about that caste identity. So can we help break the merit being associated with caste by improving the admissions process? It's better to have more homogeneous distribution, optimize assignments to have at least 20% each of reserved and non-reserved admissions in all quadrants by percentile. Better admission process will help break this perception. Again, I would say it depends on who is heading the admissions process. And, how much of say those who need affirmative action policies, because of historically being marginalized for centuries, are being allowed a say in this kind of admissions process. I think if that is more transparent, maybe we have a chance.
Yeah. So we are at the end of this session. Before that, we will conclude this session with some bullet points. Okay, so ma'am has started her presentation by giving the definition by Max Weber. And then again, she showed the similarity of class, between class and caste. The third point was the social economic order are not independent, but they are interdependent. And the differences between class and caste, the similarity and differences both she has shown. The brief history of the middle class, and she has narrated all the kind of quoted some of the authors also. And the caste in the corporate sector and the entrepreneurship sector, and because it is an emerging kind of thing, because people are now unemployed and most of the in the youth now seeking or going for the entrepreneurship, and they are also facing this caste issue there. The caste in the public sector, as this public sector is almost there even after our independence, and the precarity and acquisitive society. So this whole session was quite informative and quite relevant to the present context. With this note, I would like to give a thanks to ma'am for giving this wonderful session to us and giving some kind of insights, the present condition of caste, class, and how it operates in different sectors in the Indian context. So with this, thank you, ma'am, for your time and your efforts for this.
And yeah, and also thank you to all the participants, especially those who have asked the question, that also, and those who haven't asked the question. But I would like to take the name Vidyanand Khandagade and Dr. Surendra Jodle sir, and thank you. Even I think I'm missing some name also. So Prakash Kumar. So all these questions has been raised. So that has contributed the discussion ahead, and I really thankful to Renu also for giving such a wonderful talk, and all of you. Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you, everybody. Thank you, Ambedkar Institute. Thank you to all the participants. I enjoyed interacting with all of you.
Yeah, thank
And I also would like to thank our IT team because they always cooperate us, and because of
Yeah.
them, we conduct such online sessions. Thank you to them also. Yeah. So we are now closing the session.
Thank you.